In the autumn of 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged in the skies above, a different kind of battle unfolded beneath the surface, a clandestine war of shadows and secrets. The streets of London, though scarred by the Blitz, remained bustling centres of commerce and communication. Yet, beneath the daily hustle, the British capital harboured an invisible enemy, German spies operating under the guise of refugees, diplomats, and businessmen. The German military intelligence service, known as the Abwehr, had long eyed Britain as a prime target for espionage. With the failure of Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, Hitler's regime turned to covert operations to weaken the island nation from within. The Abwehr's mission was clear: infiltrate Britain, gather intelligence, and sow discord. They deployed agents via various means: parachute drops, submarine landings, and through neutral countries posing as refugees. However, Britain's response was swift and strategic. MI5, the United Kingdom's domestic counterintelligence agency, had been on high alert since the onset of the war. Their primary objective was to identify and neutralize enemy agents before they could strike. The double-cross system, or XX system, emerged as MI5's most audacious counterintelligence operation. Overseen by the 20 Committee, chaired by John Cecil Masterman, the system's goal was to turn captured German spies into double agents, feeding false information back to the Nazis to mislead and confuse them. The first agent to fall into MI5's hands was Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo. A Spanish national with no formal intelligence training, Pujol approached the British Embassy in Madrid in 1941, offering his services as a spy. His motivations were complex, partly ideological, partly personal, but his offer was genuine. MI5, recognizing his potential, recruited him and began the process of turning him into a double agent. Pujol's recruitment was not without challenges. Lack of formal espionage training meant that MI5 had to provide him with the necessary skills and resources. They supplied him with false documents, taught him how to handle secret communications, and established a network of fictitious agents to support his cover story. The British also provided him with a radio transmitter to send coded messages to Germany, though these messages were carefully crafted to mislead the enemy. The Abwehr, eager to expand its network in Britain, welcomed Pujol's offer. They were unaware that he was already under British control. Pujol's first mission was to establish contact with the Germans, which he did by sending a letter to the Abwehr's London office, posing as a disillusioned British citizen willing to collaborate. The Germans, impressed by his initiative, responded positively. They provided him with instructions and resources, including a radio transmitter for secure communications. Pujol, now fully operational as a double agent, began sending regular reports to his German handlers. These reports, while appearing to be genuine intelligence, were carefully constructed fabrications designed to mislead and deceive. As Pujol's credibility grew, so did his influence within the Abwehr. He was entrusted with more significant missions, including the recruitment of additional agents. However, every new agent he introduced was, in fact, another double agent under British control. This network of false agents, all reporting back to MI5, became a powerful tool in the Allies' strategic deception efforts. The success of the double-cross system was not just due to the ingenuity of MI5, but also to the cooperation of individuals like Pujol, who risked everything to serve a cause greater than themselves. Their efforts played a crucial role in the Allied victory, particularly in the lead-up to D-Day, where the deception campaign convinced the Germans that the invasion would occur at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. In the shadows of London, amidst the chaos of war, a network of spies and counter-spies wove a complex web of deception. Their actions, though unseen by the public eye, had a profound impact on the course of history. The story of these unsung heroes serves as a testament to the power of intelligence, the art of deception, and the resilience of those who fight in the shadows. London, in late 1940, was a city simultaneously scarred and alive. The Blitz had left rooftops jagged and streets fractured, yet commerce persisted. Buses rattled along the avenues, and the hum of a wartime metropolis never ceased. Amid the chaos, the Abwehr's network worked with quiet precision, an invisible force threading through the very heart of Britain. One of their most unassuming agents, Erich Weber, would become central to a curious chapter in wartime espionage: the use of invisible ink derived from recipes in a 19th-century German cookbook. Erich Weber, 28, had grown up in Hamburg, the son of a modest grocer. His early life was marked by meticulous observation and an obsession with chemistry. He spent afternoons in his father's shop experimenting with household substances, curious how lemon juice reacted to heat or how vinegar could remove stubborn stains. To friends, he seemed an eccentric but harmless young man. To the Abwehr, he was a talent waiting to be cultivated. Recruited in 1938, Weber's charm, intellect, and precise mind made him ideal for clandestine operations. While most German agents were trained in sabotage or radio operation, Weber's specialty was subtlety, the art of blending in and transmitting intelligence in ways no one would suspect. By November 1940, Weber had been dispatched to London under the cover of a culinary scholar, posing as a visiting expert on European gastronomy. His cover was both ingenious and believable. Germany had long prided itself on its culinary heritage, and scholarly visitors were expected in Britain. He brought with him the weighty tome that would become his greatest tool, Der Kochkunst Geheimnisse, Secrets of the Culinary Arts, an 1,875 cookbook whose recipes were renowned for their detailed use of acids, inks, and pigments. Unknown to British intelligence or even the Abwehr's higher echelons, Weber had discovered that many of the recipes could double as a vehicle for invisible ink. Lemon juice, milk, diluted vinegar, and even extracts of certain herbs, common ingredients in the kitchen, could transmit messages legibly when heated or treated with specific reagents. At the time, MI5 was already aware of German espionage efforts in London, particularly the use of radio transmissions and clandestine meetings in safe houses. But the methods were predictable: coded telegrams, letter drops, and occasional hand-delivered documents. Invisible ink, though known historically, had largely fallen out of use, especially techniques derived from domestic sources. Weber's genius lay in exploiting this blind spot. He could send intelligence reports in plain sight, camouflaged as mundane correspondence or innocuous recipes. To the casual observer, his letters were nothing more than culinary notes, descriptions of stews, cakes, and sauces. To the trained eye, they carried instructions, troop movements, and the results of his observations on British military readiness. Weber's operation began quietly. Posing as a visitor from Hamburg University, he rented a small flat in Bloomsbury, surrounded by bookshops and cafes, places frequented by academics and students. He spent days observing the city, noting the movement of military convoys, the locations of anti-aircraft batteries, and the schedules of shipping along the Thames. All these observations were carefully transcribed onto slips of paper, written in the invisible inks he had perfected using the cookbook. Once completed, the recipes were mailed in seemingly mundane envelopes to a contact in neutral Switzerland, who would then forward the intelligence to Berlin. For months, Weber's letters passed inspection unnoticed. Inspectors at the post office, accustomed to finding coded letters, would see only detailed instructions for a gelatin dessert or a simmering stew. The Abwehr, initially skeptical of his methods, became convinced once they received the first decoded reports from Switzerland. The communications, though seemingly whimsical in presentation, were precise in content. German analysts marveled at the ingenuity. Weber had circumvented one of the Allies' most effective defenses without using a single radio transmission, a method that could be triangulated or jammed. By hiding in plain sight, he operated under a protective cloak woven from domesticity, an invisible thread that MI5 had yet to perceive. It was not only the cleverness of Weber's method that ensured success, but also his meticulous discipline. Each letter, each recipe, was carefully cross-referenced against official calendars, London street maps, and military schedules. A teaspoon of vinegar might indicate the timing of troop movements. A sprinkling of nutmeg could encode the number of convoys along the Thames. Weber's system was logical, mathematically precise, and rooted in his obsessive nature. For him, espionage was chemistry and mathematics combined with literature, a perfect equation solved not in a laboratory but in the heart of a besieged city. MI5, meanwhile, remained vigilant. While the double-cross system had achieved initial successes with other agents, the possibility of a network operating unnoticed always loomed. Officers patrolled suspected areas, reviewed mail under magnifying lenses, and monitored known German sympathizers. Yet Weber's operation remained invisible precisely because it exploited assumptions. MI5 expected agents to act like spies, to send coded messages, to behave with recognizable patterns. A cookbook, after all, did not fit the profile of a wartime threat. For months, he operated with impunity, his reports flowing steadily to Berlin, shaping the Abwehr's understanding of British defences, while MI5 remained unaware of the source. By February 1941, Weber's correspondence had accumulated into a significant intelligence corpus. The Abwehr began making operational decisions based on his reports, deploying agents, redirecting reconnaissance flights, and even instructing saboteurs to focus on specific targets in London, all guided by what was, in reality, culinary subterfuge. His letters, innocuous on the surface, had effectively become the conduit for a vast stream of German strategic thought, manipulated entirely by his invisible inks and coded recipes. Yet, the brilliance of Weber's method contained an inherent vulnerability. Invisible ink, while effective for stealth, could be exposed under certain conditions: heat, chemicals, or X-ray analysis. A single careful inspection could compromise months of work. MI5's methodical sweeps and inspections of suspicious correspondences were the thin thread that would eventually unravel Weber's network. But for now, in the frost-bitten days of early 1941, the shadow of a German spy moving silently through London had not yet been pierced. In the cafes of Bloomsbury, he would sit, ostensibly taking notes on a new pudding or the merits of a delicate sauce, unaware of how close the British intelligence machine was to uncovering his invisible empire. Each letter sent carried not only information but also a quiet triumph of intellect, a victory of ingenuity over suspicion. The citizens above him slept, bombs fell, and life persisted, while the invisible ink on Weber's pages charted the delicate interplay of espionage and counter-espionage in the heart of the capital. By early March 1941, London had settled into a brittle rhythm. The Blitz had eased slightly, leaving the streets scarred but functional, the underground shelters gradually emptying as citizens returned to work. The Abwehr network in the city, operating with a quiet sophistication, had become confident. Erich Weber's letters, meticulously crafted with recipes that concealed invisible ink, continued to flow steadily to Switzerland, then to Berlin. Yet, beneath the calm, MI5 had begun sensing the faintest stirrings of a threat that did not fit its usual patterns. MI5's attention had long been divided among numerous concerns. German agents posing as diplomats, sympathizers within the press, and the occasional saboteur attempting to disrupt British industry. Most of these operatives followed familiar methods: coded telegrams, clandestine meetings, and the transport of forbidden materials across borders. Weber, however, was an anomaly. His correspondence was superficially innocuous. There were no suspicious drops, no clandestine radio transmissions, and no visible signs of espionage. A well-meaning clerk handling the mail would have seen nothing more than a culinary enthusiast sharing recipes with a friend abroad. The first hints of Weber's unusual activity appeared in February 1941, when a junior MI5 officer, Detective Sergeant Arthur Coles, began cross-referencing letters sent to known foreign contacts. Coles was a meticulous man, with an obsession for patterns that often frustrated his colleagues. He noticed that letters originating from Bloomsbury to Switzerland consistently contained unusual phrasing culinary terms used in repetitive structured sequences. Initially, the language appeared to be a trivial idiosyncrasy of a gastronomic scholar, yet Coles's instinct, honed from months of tracking German agents, told him something was amiss. What drew his attention further was the consistency of timing. Weber's letters were mailed with mechanical precision, often arriving in neutral Switzerland exactly 2 weeks after dispatch. This punctuality suggested discipline beyond a casual hobbyist. Moreover, Coles noted that the letters often arrived in bulk, accompanied by marginalia and annotations that seemed unnecessary for a simple recipe exchange. His suspicion grew. What if these seemingly trivial culinary letters contained hidden intelligence? The thought, though speculative, prompted him to request that the letters be subjected to chemical inspection, a routine procedure normally reserved for more overtly suspicious correspondence. The technical staff at MI5, skilled in analyzing invisible inks and microfilm, examined the letters using a battery of tests. Heat application, ultraviolet light, iodine fuming, and chemical reagents. Initially, nothing appeared. Lemon juice, milk, and vinegar-based inks could be temperamental, and Weber had clearly perfected his methods. The hidden messages, carefully balanced in acidity and dilution, resisted exposure under casual testing. Yet, the investigators persisted. MI5's philosophy was one of methodical diligence. No pattern, however subtle, could be ignored. During the same period, Weber continued his daily routines with unruffled precision. Bloomsbury cafes remained his observational posts. From a small table near the window, he watched troop movements along the embankment, noting the timing of armoured convoys and the positioning of anti-aircraft batteries. Each observation was carefully transcribed into his invisible ink recipes. A simmering pot of beef stew might indicate the rotation of infantry units, the addition of caraway seeds, the timing of river patrols. To the casual observer, he was a harmless culinary scholar, yet in Berlin, Abwehr analysts were receiving intelligence of increasing value, informing operational decisions on shipping schedules and urban defense fortifications. By April, however, the first tentative signs of MI5 attention began to reach Weber, though he did not yet recognize them. British postal inspectors had started paying unusual attention to mail sent to Switzerland, noting the high volume and precision of dispatch. In addition, a few curious letters had been returned for incomplete addressing or delayed in the sorting offices due to heightened wartime scrutiny. While none contained explicit evidence against him, the changes in procedure hinted that MI5's surveillance was intensifying. Weber, always meticulous, began experimenting with subtle variations in his ink formulas, combinations of milk and lemon juice, diluted vinegar with a dash of alum, and herbal infusions that would remain invisible under conventional tests. Each adjustment, he reasoned, would keep his correspondence one step ahead of British detection. It was during this time that Weber's network within London became increasingly reliant on the efficiency of his invisible ink system. Agents tasked with minor intelligence collection observations of dock activity, advertisements for military recruitment, or civilian sightings of uniformed personnel delivered their reports to him. Weber transcribed these minor details into coded culinary recipes, ensuring that every message, however trivial, maintained operational security. The brilliance of the system was in its simplicity. Ordinary domesticity became the perfect camouflage. Even highly trained MI5 officers, conditioned to recognize conventional espionage tactics, could not initially conceive that recipes could serve as intelligence carriers. Yet MI5's awareness was growing. In May 1941, Coles noted a pattern in letters previously considered benign. A set of envelopes, all from Bloomsbury, shared an unusual similarity in their folding and weight distribution. While not technically a code, it suggested uniformity and intent. MI5 began implementing more sophisticated chemical tests, applying iodine vapor to entire letters, heating the paper to carefully controlled temperatures, and even using weak acids to reveal faint discoloration invisible to the naked eye. Small, nearly imperceptible traces of message began to appear in the margins of recipes, sequences of numbers, letters, and occasional shorthand that hinted at military targets. For Weber, this was the first time in months that operational risk became palpable. While he had believed his system near perfect, the subtle indications of attention from MI5 forced him to reconsider. He implemented countermeasures, varying the types of paper, altering handwriting, and occasionally interspersing truly mundane recipes with intelligence-bearing ones to create plausible deniability. The Abwehr, unaware of the precise mechanisms of MI5 detection, remained confident in his continued efficacy. Berlin received intelligence that seemed consistent and accurate, unaware that the spiderweb of counterintelligence had begun closing in around Weber. By the end of May 1941, MI5 had transitioned from suspicion to tentative identification. The pattern of letters, the consistent Swiss forwarding address, and the faint traces of invisible ink indicated that a sophisticated German agent was operating in London. Coles and his team could not yet confirm the exact source, but every test and cross-reference pointed toward a singular individual, the culinary scholar of Bloomsbury. The invisible ink recipes, derived from a 19th-century German cookbook, had performed admirably, masking a potent stream of espionage for months. Yet the first hints of detection now signaled a turning point. The game of cat and mouse between Erich Weber and MI5 was entering a critical phase. As London endured another week of air raids and blackout restrictions, Weber continued his work with quiet diligence. Each letter dispatched was a small triumph of intelligence craft. But he now understood that MI5 was alert. The invisible shield he had relied upon, the assumed harmlessness of recipes, the domestic veneer of ink and paper, was under strain. The first true challenge of his career lay ahead. Maintaining the illusion of innocence while the British intelligence service, methodical and relentless, began unraveling the pattern he had so carefully constructed. The shadow that had once been invisible was now at the threshold of visibility. By the early days of June 1941, the war in Europe had entered a new phase. Hitler's attention was increasingly focused eastward, preparing the massive Operation Barbarossa that would soon consume German resources and attention. In London, however, the shadow war continued with relentless intensity. The Blitz had lessened in scale but not in impact. Londoners moved through streets scarred by bomb craters and shrapnel-strewn avenues, their lives interwoven with the rhythm of blackouts, air raid sirens, and ration queues. For MI5, the challenge remained to protect the city from an enemy that did not arrive in waves of bombs, but in letters, photographs, and clandestine observations. Erich Weber's network had, until then, functioned with remarkable efficiency. Each recipe dispatched under his name, whether a simple cabbage stew or a complicated gâteau, carried hidden instructions: our troop movements along the Thames, naval logistics at Portsmouth, details of air raid defences, and even the occasional cipher of strategic intelligence regarding newly mobilized factories. His recipes were a masterclass in concealment, every ingredient, every notation, and even the occasional smudge of ink meticulously calculated to disguise his invisible messages. To an observer, he was simply a culinary scholar with an eccentric penchant for German cookery. To the Abwehr, he was an indispensable asset. To MI5, he was becoming increasingly suspicious. The first serious escalation occurred in June, when MI5 analysts observed that letters from Bloomsbury were not only consistent in timing, but increasingly detailed in content that corresponded too precisely with British defence arrangements. Detecting a trend, MI5 escalated surveillance. Postal inspectors were instructed to flag every outgoing letter to neutral countries, and a small cadre of intelligence officers, including Detective Sergeant Arthur Coles and Lieutenant Emily Strathmore, began to map the flow of information from London to Switzerland. Their initial task was simple: determine if these letters contained coded material, yet the ingenuity of Weber's method frustrated conventional analytical techniques. The invisible ink, derived from a 19th-century German cookbook, was proving unusually resilient. Recipes called for milk, lemon juice, diluted vinegar, and occasionally the juices of obscure vegetables or fruits, combined in proportions that rendered them undetectable by standard tests. Even the application of iodine fuming and ultraviolet light, common practices against simple acids, failed to reveal the hidden intelligence. MI5 officers, however, were not deterred. Under strict wartime secrecy, laboratories were established in temporary offices across London, blending chemistry, patience, and trial and error to uncover the invisible transmissions. Meanwhile, Weber continued his operations with a practiced nonchalance. Each morning, he would leave his modest Bloomsbury apartment, briefcase under his arm, and take the same route past Tottenham Court Road to the Swiss consulate. There, letters were collected under the guise of neutral correspondence, then forwarded along standard diplomatic channels to Zurich. The timing of his walks, the books he carried, and even his interactions with post clerks were measured with precise care. The illusion of mundane routine was central to his craft. Any irregularity could invite scrutiny, and Weber was aware that MI5 had begun to suspect something beyond trivial correspondence. By July, MI5's investigations were producing partial results. Though they could not yet definitively identify Weber or fully decode his methods, subtle traces of invisible ink began to appear in the margins of recipes, faint as shadows. A carefully calibrated application of heat revealed discoloration along the edges of a recipe for kohlrouladen, exposing a kohlrouladen, a pattern of letters and numbers that appeared meaningless on their own, but suggested a hidden communication system. MI5 analysts began to hypothesize that what appeared to be culinary shorthand might correspond to military coordinates or operational timings. The sophistication of Weber's work was evident. Even the slightest over-application of ink, the wrong acidity, or the wrong type of paper could render the hidden message useless. At the same time, Weber faced logistical challenges of his own. The network he managed required coordination with a small group of collaborators who were equally adept at blending into the fabric of London life. One operative observed troop movements near dockyards, another monitored aircraft assembly lines at suburban factories, while a third collected seemingly mundane city intelligence, such as the flow of rations or the scheduling of transport convoys. Each observation was transcribed into invisible ink recipes, maintaining operational security while disguising the intelligence as domestic correspondence. Weber's genius was in the naturalness of the system. There was no radio transmission to triangulate, no meeting to surveil, and no overt act of espionage that could easily be traced. However, by August, the tension in Weber's operations began to mount. MI5 had intensified monitoring, and small anomalies in postal handling began to be noted by Weber's network. Letters that once passed with perfect timing were delayed, occasionally misrouted, and returned with minimal but noticeable alterations. These disruptions, though minor, suggested that MI5's scrutiny was becoming more precise. Weber's instinct, honed through years of espionage training, prompted him to introduce greater variability in his transmissions. He varied his ink formulations, modified handwriting styles, and interspersed purely domestic recipes with intelligence-bearing ones. These countermeasures bought him time, but the invisible net was closing. During this period, MI5 also initiated surveillance of Weber's physical movements. Observers discreetly tracked his daily walks and interactions, noting patterns that, while mundane on the surface, could indicate clandestine behavior. Though Weber remained aware of these potential threats, the risk of exposure weighed heavily. Any misstep, leaving a letter unattended, conversing in the presence of an untrustworthy individual, or misapplying his ink formulas, could unravel months of meticulous work. The psychological pressure was compounded by the knowledge that the intelligence he transmitted was of strategic significance. Miscalculations could imperil Allied operations if intercepted by the wrong hands. The Abwehr, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of the increasing strain. From Berlin, they assessed Weber's contributions as consistent and highly effective. Reports derived from his invisible ink letters informed decisions regarding troop deployments, logistical schedules, and even minor strategic adjustments within occupied territories. To the German High Command, Weber was a model agent, unobtrusive, precise, and extraordinarily reliable. The irony, of course, was that MI5 was closing in, unraveling the very methods that Berlin trusted implicitly. By the end of August 1941, the stage was set for the confrontation that would determine the fate of Weber's network. MI5 had gathered sufficient circumstantial evidence to justify focused counterintelligence operations. even if they had not yet fully penetrated the invisible ink system. Weber, aware that the British were becoming increasingly vigilant, refined his methods once more, alternating ink types, modifying paper textures, and adjusting his dispatch schedules. Each decision was made with calculated care. The margin for error had narrowed to fractions of a millimetre. As summer drew to a close, London continued its rhythm of vigilance and endurance. Air raid sirens faded in the daytime but remained a grim reminder of the city's vulnerability. MI5. Now aware that a German agent of unusual ingenuity was operating in the city, intensified its efforts to decode the invisible communications. Weber, the consummate spy, continued his quiet work, confident in his craft, yet increasingly conscious that every letter dispatched could be scrutinized with the meticulous attention of Britain's finest counterintelligence officers. The invisible duel between Erich Weber and MI5 had entered its most critical phase. Each party, armed with ingenuity, patience, and unwavering resolve, maneuvered in a game of shadows. MI5 sought the faintest anomaly that could betray the presence of espionage. Weber relied on centuries-old culinary formulas to cloak the transmission of vital intelligence. In this interplay of observation, deduction, and subtle subterfuge, the city itself became a theatre of invisible conflict. Every letter, a potential weapon, and every recipe, a coded missive carrying the weight of war. By early September 1941, London had settled into a grim routine. The Blitz was over, but the scars remained: damaged streets, shattered windows, and neighbourhoods patched with temporary timber and tar paper. Life continued in the shadow of wartime austerity, ration queues, blackout curtains, and constant vigilance against the unseen enemy. Yet the real war in the city was not fought with bombs or artillery, but with pen and paper, invisible ink, and coded recipes. MI5's counterintelligence efforts had begun to bear fruit. The shadow that had eluded detection for months now faced the first tangible threats to its concealment. The breakthrough came at the Central Postal Sorting Office, where Detective Sergeant Arthur Coles and Lieutenant Emily Strathmore had painstakingly catalogued hundreds of letters intercepted from the Bloomsbury area. What had initially appeared to be ordinary correspondence letters to neutral countries, notes of gratitude, and culinary musings revealed subtle anomalies upon closer examination. Faint discolorations along margins, imperceptible to the naked eye, suggested that some of these recipes contained more than mere cooking instructions. Using rudimentary chemical tests in improvised laboratory conditions, the analysts confirmed their suspicions. Traces of invisible ink were present. The ink itself was a marvel of historical ingenuity. Derived from 19th-century German cookbooks, the formula relied on naturally acidic liquids, lemon juice, milk, vinegar, and occasionally extracts from obscure vegetables like salsify or celeriac. The precise combinations allowed the writing to remain invisible under normal light, with only controlled heat or chemical reagents revealing the hidden script. MI5 chemists faced a daunting challenge. The inks varied from letter to letter, each one uniquely tailored to avoid detection. Simple application of iodine fuming, standard for acid-based inks, yielded inconsistent results. It was clear that the spy later identified as Erich Weber possessed both technical knowledge and a deep understanding of chemistry. The first fully revealed message provided the breakthrough. A recipe for gefilte paprika, sent to a supposed cousin in Zurich, disclosed what appeared to be nonsensical strings of numbers and letters when the invisible ink was developed. MI5 analysts, led by cryptanalyst Margaret Harrington, recognized patterns reminiscent of coordinate plotting and troop movement indicators. Comparing the data to known deployment schedules of the Home Guard and other civil defense units, the team realized that these letters contained actionable intelligence. Locations of anti-aircraft batteries, patrol timings, and even subtle cues about industrial shipments. The significance of the discovery rippled through MI5 headquarters. The Invisible Ink Division, previously considered a minor facet of counterintelligence, became the epicenter of a coordinated effort to dismantle Weber's network. Lieutenant Strathmore, who had meticulously traced Weber's daily routines, noted that the delivery patterns and Swiss diplomatic pickups coincided precisely with the encoded messages. It was a matter of time before the physical evidence and the behavioral surveillance converged, confirming the presence of a high-value agent operating in the city. Weber, for his part, remained unaware of the full extent of MI5's penetration. His confidence in the efficacy of his recipes had persisted through months of operation. Each dispatch had been prepared with painstaking attention: the right acidity in the milk, the correct paper texture, and the precise folding of the letter to prevent accidental exposure. Even subtle variations in his handwriting, deliberate slanting, microspacing, and flourishes were designed to mislead casual observers. Yet the agents of MI5 were methodical. They combined physical surveillance, chemical analysis, and pattern recognition to identify anomalies that Weber had not anticipated. One critical miscalculation on Weber's part involved the Swiss consulate pickups. The Abwehr had arranged for consistent collection times to maintain operational efficiency. For months, this schedule had gone unchallenged. MI5, exploiting predictable routines, orchestrated a careful delay and interception of a batch of letters. When the letters were retrieved, subjected to enhanced chemical treatment and heat exposure, the invisible messages emerged intact. This interception provided MI5 with the first undeniable proof that Weber's network was transmitting intelligence under the guise of innocuous culinary correspondence. The decoded messages revealed both the breadth and the precision of Weber's espionage. Instructions included timings for convoy movements along the Thames, details of repair schedules at key naval dockyards, and the locations of newly installed radar stations. Even minor logistical details, such as supply deliveries to airfields and fuel depots, were meticulously encoded. The intelligence indicated that Weber had developed an extraordinarily sophisticated system of reconnaissance, relying on a small but highly effective network of collaborators. Each collaborator, embedded in mundane civilian roles, had provided critical observations that were then translated into recipes by Weber. Despite the success of MI5's analysis, the spy's ingenuity remained formidable. The messages, though revealed, were not immediately intelligible without context. Weber's recipes had incorporated multiple layers of obfuscation: numeric codes for coordinates, ingredient substitutions for operational details, and timing indicators disguised as cooking instructions. To reconstruct the operational significance, MI5 analysts had to cross-reference postal data, surveillance reports, and civil defense schedules. It was a painstaking process that required both patience and insight. The stakes escalated in October 1941 when MI5 observed Weber attempting to vary his operations in response to perceived threats. He changed paper types, switched ink recipes, and altered the cadence of his letter dispatches. The agents of MI5, however, were prepared. Surveillance had become so precise that Weber's daily walks and postal interactions were logged with minute-level accuracy. Each anomaly he introduced was catalogued, analyzed, and incorporated into the growing understanding of his methodology. MI5 now had both chemical proof and behavioral tracking, allowing them to predict with increasing certainty his next moves. By November, the trap was nearly complete. MI5 orchestrated a dual approach: chemical interception of letters combined with physical observation of Weber's routines. An undercover postal inspector, following closely from the street to the consulate, ensured that each dispatch could be intercepted without alerting the target. Laboratory teams were prepared to process each intercepted letter immediately, using heat, ultraviolet exposure, and chemical reagents to reveal the hidden scripts. The intelligence community now had the upper hand, though Weber remained dangerously unaware. In retrospect, the success of MI5's operation highlighted a convergence of disciplines: chemistry, cryptography, and traditional surveillance. Weber's reliance on historical recipes and invisible ink had initially provided him a unique advantage, fooling even the most seasoned intelligence officers for months. Yet the meticulous, multifaceted approach of MI5, integrating laboratory science, behavioral observation, and postal monitoring, eventually overcame his ingenuity. The stage was set for the final confrontation, a combination of strategy and serendipity that would determine the fate of Weber's network and, more broadly, the security of London itself. By late November 1941, MI5 had not only confirmed Weber's methods but had begun to anticipate them. Each intercepted letter, each developed recipe, provided further insight into his operational patterns. The net, which had tightened invisibly around the German spy for months, was now poised to close completely. Weber's reliance on centuries-old culinary techniques, once his greatest asset, had become the very clue that led to his exposure. In the quiet, unassuming offices of MI5 laboratories, the invisible war had finally tipped in favor of the British. December 1941 brought more than frost and blackouts to London. For MI5, it heralded the final phase of a months-long pursuit. The invisible web spun by Erich Weber, the German spy, was no longer untouchable. Surveillance logs showed his familiar routine: morning walks through Bloomsbury, letters folded meticulously into envelopes, and brief visits to a modest Swiss consulate office where the dispatches were collected. Every step was predictable, a testament to his reliance on habit, a vulnerability MI5 had been quietly cultivating. The agency devised a careful, multi-layered trap. Postal interception continued, but now every letter was immediately processed in the laboratories at Blenheim Place. Chemists applied heat and chemical reagents to reveal the invisible ink recipes. Then cryptanalysts began the painstaking work of translating coded ingredients into operational intelligence. Simultaneously, undercover operatives shadowed Weber, mapping every interaction, every route to the consulate, and every contact with his local collaborators. The British knew that Weber's confidence in his historical recipes made him unlikely to vary his methods dramatically, even under suspicion. That hubris would be his undoing. MI5's plan hinged on controlled exposure. Certain letters, laced with deliberate misinformation but formatted identically to Weber's usual recipes, were allowed to reach the consulate. Weber's network, unknowingly, transmitted the disinformation back to Abwehr headquarters in Berlin. By monitoring German communications, MI5 could trace the pathways of his intelligence while simultaneously confirming the structure and reach of his operations. This clever deception, the first of its kind in the Invisible Ink campaign, would reveal both the network's composition and its ultimate vulnerabilities. On New Year's Eve, the trap was set. Weber dispatched a final batch of letters, each meticulously prepared with the invisible ink formulas he had perfected over months. Observers noted his characteristic precision. Each envelope creased to the millimeter, each recipe folded in a sequence that had never failed. Unbeknownst to him, a postal inspector followed at a discreet distance, ensuring that the letters never reached the Swiss consulate. Inside the MI5 laboratories, the letters were developed under controlled conditions, revealing the full extent of Weber's communications. Coordinates, logistical information, and detailed instructions confirmed the identity of his accomplices, the timing of their operations, and the precise locations of the intelligence targets. For the first time, MI5 had a complete operational picture. Weber's reliance on a centuries-old cookbook, a brilliant method that had initially allowed him to bypass scrutiny, was now a liability. The agency prepared for the final act: coordinated arrests, the neutralization of the network, and the extraction of Weber himself. The trap would not rely on brute force alone, but on careful timing, psychological pressure, and the exploitation of habits he had cultivated for months. By January 1942, every piece was in place. MI5's invisible hand reached across London, ready to strike. The city's shadows, long home to the spy's clandestine movements, would finally conceal him no longer. The stage was set, and the endgame of one of World War II's most ingenious espionage operations was about to unfold. Weber's transfer from the holding cell to the interrogation suite was conducted with the utmost discretion. No photographer, no press, only the quiet footsteps of MI5 officers, the occasional clink of keys, and the low hum of ventilation. The agency understood the stakes. German intelligence would have expected him to vanish or resist, and any rumor could compromise the unraveling investigation. For Weber, the isolation was as disorienting as it was intimidating. Gone were the familiar streets of Bloomsbury, the neutral facade of the Swiss consulate, and even the tactile reassurance of his cookbooks. In their place were stark walls, sharp lighting, and the quiet authority of those who had anticipated his every move. The first interrogation session was almost conversational. Officers carefully established the boundaries. They did not threaten, they did not coerce, yet their knowledge of Weber's operations was explicit and undeniable. Letters he had sent, decoded and printed in full, lay on the table in front of him. Invisible ink that had been invisible for months now revealed its secrets, under the chemical treatments developed by MI5's laboratory teams. Weber's pride in his ingenuity was met by irrefutable evidence. The very recipes that had enabled him to fool MI5 now demonstrated the extent of his capture. As the days progressed, interrogation intensified. Weber's initial denials gave way to selective admissions, revealing layers of his operation in fragments. MI5's strategy was to allow him a controlled narrative, encouraging him to fill gaps voluntarily. Officers alternated between scrutiny and quiet patience, applying psychological pressure subtly. They introduced the names of collaborators, the specifics of coded messages, and the routes by which letters travelled across London to neutral embassies. Each revelation was cross-verified with intelligence gathered from postal interception, lab analysis, and observation of suspects under surveillance. The meticulous orchestration left Weber with little room for deception. What became clear over the following weeks was the depth of Weber's reliance on his historical recipes. These 19th-century ink formulas had initially provided a perfect cover. No agent, no postal worker, no codebreaker suspected the banal instructions of a cookbook could carry state secrets. But that very trust in antiquity had created patterns. Weber habitually prepared inks in a certain way, folded letters with a consistent sequence, and even chose specific recipes for particular types of intelligence. MI5 exploited these habits, turning them into a forensic trail that mapped the entire network. By mid-February, Weber's interrogations revealed not only operational details, but also the psychological anatomy of a spy. He spoke of the thrill of clever concealment, the satisfaction of evading detection, and the hubris that had blinded him to the persistence of British counterintelligence. Even as he confessed, there was a peculiar mixture of admiration and frustration in his demeanour, a grudging respect for an enemy, who had outmanoeuvred him without gunfire or violence, relying instead on science, observation, and patience. The capture and subsequent confessions sealed the fate of his network. Letters were recovered, collaborators identified, and Abwehr operations in London disrupted for months. What began as a clever exploitation of invisible ink ended in a meticulous dismantling of an espionage web, demonstrating MI5's ability to combine psychology, chemistry, and surveillance in unprecedented ways. Erich Weber's brilliance, born from centuries-old recipes, had been rendered irrelevant by methodical, modern intelligence. The dismantling of Weber's network sent ripples through London's intelligence community. By March 1942, MI5 had not only neutralized a highly effective spy ring but had gained insight into operational methods that had, until then, been largely theoretical. The capture of Erich Weber and his subsequent confessions provided unprecedented access to the Abwehr tradecraft, revealing the astonishing reliance of German agents on low-tech methods disguised as cultural or scholarly pursuits. What seemed to British eyes like a quaint indulgence, a 19th-century cookbook, recipes for lemon juice, milk, and other seemingly harmless substances, was in fact a sophisticated vector for strategic intelligence. In the weeks following the unravelling of the network, MI5 undertook a comprehensive review of British counter-espionage protocols. The agency recognised that their success had depended on a convergence of disciplines: chemistry, surveillance, and the careful observation of human behaviour. Laboratory teams had painstakingly analysed every letter intercepted over the previous months, comparing handwriting, folding patterns, and chemical residues. The invisible inks Weber had relied upon various combinations of ferrous sulfate, lemon acid, milk proteins, and tinctures derived from botanical sources, had been rendered legible through controlled heat, chemical reagents, and ultraviolet light. Each decoded letter corroborated reports from informants, postal inspectors, and neighbor observations, producing a complete operational map of the network. The post-capture interrogations also revealed a previously unrecognized aspect of German intelligence: the reliance on predictability. Weber's network, brilliant in concept, was built around consistency. Each courier followed set routes. Each message employed the same types of invisible ink for specific categories of intelligence, and every letter contained idiosyncratic folding patterns, chosen with the belief that triviality would mask strategy. MI5 realized that this human tendency toward routine could be exploited systematically. In subsequent months, London-based counterintelligence officers began developing pattern recognition protocols, identifying agents not by direct observation but by the subtle consistencies in their materials and methods. This would become a cornerstone of wartime British intelligence, influencing operations for the remainder of the conflict. Meanwhile, Erich Weber himself became both a source and a cautionary tale. His background, educated in Berlin, with formal training in chemistry and literature, recruited by the Abwehr through academic channels, offered insight into the type of individuals the Germans favored for clandestine operations. He was meticulous, disciplined, and entirely confident in the ingenuity of his methods. Yet, it was precisely this confidence that allowed MI5 to exploit him. By creating an environment where he believed his network remained undetected, British officers elicited detailed narratives of operations, couriers, and contacts without resorting to coercion. Weber's confessions painted a vivid picture: how letters moved from German handlers to neutral embassies, how coded phrases were embedded in otherwise mundane passages, and how seemingly trivial culinary instructions were converted into instructions for troop movements, shipping schedules, and industrial production data. By mid-1942, the impact of the operation extended beyond the immediate disruption of the network. MI5 implemented new training programs emphasizing chemical literacy, pattern recognition, and the psychological analysis of spies. Postal inspectors were trained to recognize anomalies in correspondence, minute variations in foldings, ink absorption, and paper texture. Laboratory chemists expanded their capacity to detect invisible inks, experimenting with reagents, thermal gradients, and spectroscopy. The British understood that espionage would not be won merely through agents on the street, but through an integrated system in which human intuition, chemical science, and operational foresight combined. Weber's defeat became a template for these methods. The German reaction was swift, though largely muted in public. Abwehr communications, intercepted by British intelligence, revealed a flurry of internal messages, emphasizing both shock and urgency. One decrypted note from Berlin instructed field agents to cease using historical ink recipes, labeling them compromised and obsolete, and to adopt new methods of message concealment. Yet, the internal upheaval had already caused damage. London-based operations were suspended, agents recalled, and contacts abroad were placed under heightened scrutiny. Post-war interrogations would confirm that the loss of the network disrupted German intelligence flow for months, depriving Hitler's command of critical updates on British defense plans, production schedules, and shipping movements during a period of heightened strategic significance. Simultaneously, the story of Weber and his invisible ink attracted interest in intelligence circles beyond Britain. Allied intelligence agencies, including the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, OSS, studied the operation closely. The OSS recognized parallels between Weber's methods and emerging concerns in the Pacific Theater, where Japanese operatives employed similarly low-tech but ingenious concealment techniques. Lessons from London informed training programs in Washington, Cairo, and New Delhi. By emphasizing both the limitations and vulnerabilities of agents' reliance on predictable methods, Allied operatives began developing protocols that combined rapid chemical analysis with detailed behavioral profiling. The final months of 1942 also saw Weber's network influence the broader morale and perception of espionage on both sides. British newspapers remained largely silent, but within MI5, the capture became a touchstone of institutional pride. Officers shared accounts of the laboratory breakthroughs, the painstaking observation of couriers, and the nuanced psychological interplay that had drawn Weber into confession. At the same time, the Germans, aware that their agent had been unmasked, experienced a subtle but significant erosion of confidence. The capture and subsequent revelations about invisible ink demonstrated the limits of seemingly clever methods when faced with disciplined, interdisciplinary counterintelligence. In the larger context of the war, the Weber operation underscored a recurring theme. Technological sophistication was not always the determinant of success, and human ingenuity, when applied to routine, predictable methods, could be countered through patience, science, and observation. While spies like Weber believed they were leveraging the past recipes from cookbooks, formulas passed down through decades, they underestimated the adaptive capacity of an organization operating in real time, capable of combining chemistry, psychology, and procedural rigor. The invisible ink, once a symbol of clever subterfuge, became the instrument of Weber's exposure, a testament to MI5's strategic depth and meticulous attention to detail. By December 1942, Erich Weber remained in custody, his fate sealed but his legacy, enduring as a case study in espionage and counterintelligence. MI5 had achieved more than the neutralization of a single network. It had demonstrated the efficacy of integrated intelligence work and the enduring importance of the human factor. The lessons from London's shadowed streets would reverberate through Allied intelligence operations for the remainder of the war, influencing training, laboratory development, and field protocols across Europe and the Pacific. In the quiet aftermath of Weber's capture, the agency had transformed an isolated event into a blueprint for enduring success, a testament to discipline, patience, and the subtle power of observation. By early 1943, the reverberations of Weber's capture extended far beyond the immediate disruption of his network. MI5 had transformed a single counterintelligence victory into a model for enduring operational methodology. Analysts and field officers alike recognized that the lessons drawn from London's shadowed streets were applicable across theatres and disciplines. The use of invisible ink, once thought to be a trivial or even quaint aspect of espionage, had revealed the vulnerabilities inherent in human predictability. The Germans had relied on agents who were skilled, meticulous, and confident, but also consistent. In intelligence work, it was precisely this consistency that proved fatal. The Abwehr, shaken by the exposure of Weber's network, attempted to recalibrate its methods. New directives called for the abandonment of historical recipes, the adoption of chemical innovations, and the introduction of erratic courier patterns. Yet these changes came too late to repair the damage. Decrypted communications captured in late 1943 and 1944 show repeated frustration. Agents were intercepted, messages were misdelivered, and contact points in neutral territories were compromised. MI5's forensic and observational expertise, honed on Weber's network, allowed British counterintelligence to anticipate moves that even the Abwehr considered unpredictable. In effect, the psychological insight gained from Weber's methods became a force multiplier for Allied operations. Beyond immediate intelligence gains, the Weber case reshaped British thinking about espionage education and laboratory capabilities. Training programs instituted in mid-1942 matured into full-scale curricula by 1943, emphasizing chemical literacy, field observation, and behavioral analysis. Laboratory teams expanded their capacity for ink detection and pattern recognition, developing procedures that could decode new formulations within hours of interception. Postal inspectors and counterintelligence officers were cross-trained, creating a hybrid workforce capable of identifying espionage activity without reliance on a single specialization. In this sense, the Weber operation catalyzed the modernization of British intelligence, a transformation that would endure well beyond the war. The psychological impact on both sides was equally profound. On the German side, the revelation that a single London-based network had been entirely unmasked fostered an erosion of confidence. Post-war interrogations of Abwehr officers, conducted by Allied intelligence between 1945 and 1946, repeatedly cited the Weber operation as emblematic of operational failure. German communications reflect an acute awareness that even the most carefully trained agents could be neutralized if their methods, no matter how clever, were predictable. For British operatives, the success bolstered morale and validated the integration of scientific methods into intelligence work. It demonstrated that victory in espionage required not only human intuition but systematic rigor and interdisciplinary cooperation. The legacy of Weber's operation extended beyond Europe. In the Pacific Theater, Allied intelligence officers studying Japanese espionage noted parallels between Weber's invisible ink use and emerging Japanese methods of message concealment. Lessons from London were disseminated to the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, 13 Fighter Command intelligence units, and other forward-deployed Allied operations. By combining laboratory analysis with behavioral profiling, Allied forces were able to identify and intercept Japanese messages that relied on similar low-tech concealment techniques, disrupting enemy operations and providing critical insight for strategic planning. Finally, the historical significance of the Weber operation lies in its demonstration that human ingenuity, when applied systematically, can be countered through observation, science, and patience.